Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Once again, thank you everyone for attending today's presentation. Today's educational webinar is the California Consumer Privacy Act 2018 Overview and Strategy Development Approach, brought to you by Datasource Consulting, an EXL company. As you know, we are big believers in educating the data community on what we're passionate about and continuously learning about here at Datasource. Our speaker today is Solomon Williams, our Director of EDM Solutions, who I'll introduce in more detail here shortly. But let me first tell you a little bit about Datasource and how and why we know about this topic. Solomon, if you want to go to the next slide here. Thank you. We are a pure-play enterprise data management, modern data architecture, and decision intelligence consulting firm. About a year and a half ago, we were acquired by EXL Service as part of their analytics arm. So we're really excited to now be able to offer the end-to-end solutions from managing enterprise data to providing the deeper business insights. And as far as how we deliver, we divide our services into two categories. We have the strategic work where we're doing data governance, vendor tool evaluation and selection, data virtualization, establishing programs, and then, we've got the implementation arm, the doers, the engineers, and architects who work closely with the internal client teams to help deliver on the recommendations we make through our strategy work. And those include the architecture and cloud and BI, decision intelligence, data quality, and MDM. And let me introduce you now to your guest speaker, Solomon Williams. Do you want to go to the next slide, Solomon? Thank you. Solomon has over 20 years of experience in enterprise data management with an emphasis on enterprise data architecture, master data management, service-oriented architecture, data governance, quality, integration, and warehousing. So he does it all. He's highly skilled, both strategically and technically, with an incredible proven track record, and he has experience in multiple industries, including financial services, insurance, consumer goods, oil and gas, and healthcare. He brings a really unique combination of operational and technical expertise to his role here at Datasource by leveraging his skills acquired during tenure as a senior manager of enterprise information at Toyota Financial, MDM specialist at Informatica, and a senior principal at Hewlett Packard. So we're really happy to have him not only as our speaker today, but as a part of our team. He's a great presenter too, so you're in for a good webinar today. So this topic, the California Consumer Privacy Act is huge right now, especially coming off the heels of GDPR earlier. This legislation will be effective January 1st, 2020, and that is going to be here before you know it. So we really wanted to give you our take on what this can mean for your business and how to make sure you're compliant. So again, thank you all for joining. We're really excited for this presentation, and I do want to mention that if you have questions, you can utilize the questions field at the bottom of your GoToWebinar panel. We'll address those in the Q&A during the last 10 to 15 minutes of this session, and so with that, I will hand it off to Solomon.
And thank you. Thank you so much, Allison. And everyone, thank you for joining us today. We are truly excited to be able to present some information on this topic, as well as share some thoughts around our approach on strategy development. And what does that really mean to your organization, not only from embracing this regulation, making sure that your data, technology, and processes are compliant to this regulation, but then also how do you maintain this capability that's once you bring it into your environment. A lot of organizations have data privacy strategies and they have data compliance strategies, and what we have to do is not necessarily think about that thing that we pull out of the drawer every time someone mentions regulation, but it really should be that living, breathing part of the organization as well. Just like the servers, the operations, keeping those green lights on, how do we keep these compliance and these regulatory capabilities, support capabilities top of mind and refreshed? So what is that strategy for managing data privacy and compliance? Because it's only going to grow. It's only going to become more daunting as cyber capabilities enhance and the volume of data enhances and the Internet of Things growing more pervasive. information security, data privacy, and the cybersecurity components are going to continue to grow. So we're going to step through a few of those things today. But before we jump into the middle of it, there is some of the legal business we have to get out the way, just so everyone's aware. This is not legal advice or legal analysis. We are not lawyers. We are not attorneys. What we are a data management firm. This is to be considered only as a starting point, and with regard to interpretation of what the legislation means to your organization, you absolutely do need to rely upon either your internal legal, external legal counsel, or whatever that might be that fits your organization. But we just want to be very, very clear, we're not lawyers, and this is not legal advice. So just to make sure everybody's clear on that, I'm going to say it one more time. We are not lawyers, and we are not providing legal advice. Alrighty then. So now we're going to jump into the heart and the good stuff of it. So just really quickly, Datasource Consulting, for those that are not familiar, as Allison alluded to in the introduction, we are an enterprise data management firm. We work across a number of different industries, but some of the key repeating factors that we see across industries are what we're sharing here. And this is literally the Internet of Things, different operating models, data and analytics, whether you're investigating blockchain or leveraging blockchain, or if you're investigating or leveraging AI, artificial intelligence, or omni-channel, whether that's omni-channel sales, omni-channel customer engagement, omni-channel production sourcing. Data security, data privacy spans every one of those things. If you are touching one of these areas, if you're leveraging one of these areas, data privacy should be a central theme, should be a central component of it. The more we share information with our business partners, the more information we share with our customers, the more information we share even within the organization, within our own respective organizations, you are giving that capability to say, well, they should have or they should not have access to this data. This data should be shared in this way. It should not be shared in this way. Data at rest, data at motion. Is it secured? Is it encrypted? Is it obfuscated? Is it masked? All of these things come to bear regardless of what aspect of this that you're touching. And it's just one of the key aspects of that data security and governance, and why we placed it here is central to all of these things. And it's just one of the things that, again, these cross-industry imperatives that we see as we engage with various clients across various industries. So our view, data regulation is here to stay. As I mentioned, it is been growing, but what's interesting is not only does it grow in breadth, but it grows in depth and complexity. And as we're going to step through some of our high-level reviews of what we found, even with the CCPA, that this data regulation compliance, looking at information security and what does that mean? What does it really mean for privacy management of data? We are sharing data even in our own individual lives. We're sharing data with numerous business partners, numerous organizations, but doesn't that also mean that there is some responsibility and accountability on the side of that organization to ensure that our data is not being used in a way that we would be uncomfortable with? And that's literally how you have to internalize it, regardless if it's your demographic information, your financial information, your health information, your family information. We determine who we want to share that with and when, but there also must be safeguards in place that says this data shouldn't be used in a way that we wouldn't agree with. And so in so doing, as you can imagine, as these more and more capabilities come about from a technology and a cyber perspective, that there will be a plethora and greatly more complex capabilities around what data regulations are. And so these numerous recent data management regulation additions and the continuing, again, growth and expansion of cyber capabilities just lays the groundwork for more regulations are coming. And we have to be in a situation where every time a new regulation comes up, it's not a complete redress or re-architecture of what our data privacy, information security, and cybersecurity capabilities are. We shouldn't have to rebuild the house every single time. We should be in a situation where we can be proactive enough to understand what it means, and then reactive enough to do what's tactical and pragmatic. So that, we're not running at this with, oh my God, the world's on fire, the ceiling's on. No, we just need to understand what it means and how to approach it. What that does mean is that we need to adopt a posture across process, people, as well as technologies, that it's very rarely ever going to be a situation where, oh, this is just a technology problem. I'm going to install a bit of software and everything is going to be fine. Or we're going to hire 50 people, and 50 people, this is what they're going to focus on. Not likely to happen from a financial constraint perspective, but just realistically, throwing bodies at a problem generally has a very quick diminishing point of return, what the value is in getting there. So being more proactive and more strategic and understanding, well, how is this going to impact across the organization? And then again, having a model from an organization perspective that allows us to absorb these changes, and then again, proactively understand, and then tactically and pragmatically react to them is one of the key things that we want to talk about. And then particularly with CCPA, it is really focused on regulatory requirements, and it really needs to be understood what that means from strategy development, estimates of implementation, and how do you estimate the ongoing compliance. And again, we're using CCPA because this is the most broadest privacy reg in the US, which has been enacted. There are a number of states that are closely looking at CCPA and are looking at fast following adoption of similar regulation for their own states. So it seems that what California has done, they've not done with a view that, oh, this is only going to be California. No, there are other states, many other states, that are looking at adopting a very similar framework for managing the privacy data of their residents as well. So now we're going to jump really into an overview of what CCPA is. So the California Consumer Privacy Act of 2018, as I mentioned, is the most broad-reaching data privacy legislation enacted in the U.S. Now, it's very similar to a GDPR for Europe, but there are some significant differences. But again, this is enacted primarily, in the state of California. And just to call out a few key items of what it does. So it expands organizational responsibilities of the company. Like I said, so if you are a resident and you are sharing information with companies, you have the right to hold them accountable, or at least CCPA states that there should be some accountability to what you do with that data. Is that data allowed to be sold? What type of transferring? And sold has a number of different definitions under this legislation. So it's not like, oh, company A is going to receive legal tender for a batch of data. Yeah, that's one definition. But there are numerous definitions that say, hey, you know what? It could be a trade. If you're trading a volume of data for this, or you're leveraging this batch of data sets in order to receive some service at a discount, that also counts as sold. So you have to have some accountability as to the individual, what you're doing with my data, and are you doing things with it that I may or may not agree with. Establish new rules, how to govern business, how to handle data in California. There is a lot around this that says exactly what is allowed to be done with the data, what the data is to be used for, how long the data is to be kept. There's a lot of things in there that really establish some fairly strong guide rails around that. and the requires that companies allow consumers to opt out of having their data sold. This is one of the biggest differences between CCPA and GDPR, wherein regardless of channel, whether it's a IVR, it's a web portal, it's some digital or even paper document that you have to give a customer immediately. So it's a pop-up. I know a lot of folks that are on the web, you're seeing a lot of these notifications of cookies where, hey, we're going to be collecting information. You can opt out of being tracked. You can opt. That's going to have to be on every site where information is being collected. It's going to have to be on the IVR when you dial up. It's going to have to be in the CRM application during a customer engagement or in a customer encounter. Customers have to be very aware of their right to opt out of having their data sold. One of the more interesting points around this is, again, a departure from GDPR, is that the customer cannot be treated any differently, meaning that if you're going to have discounts, if there's going to be sales opportunities, if there's going to be any type of treatment disparity between those that opt in and those that opt out, those that opt out of having their data sold, that's something that CCPA is advising that no, you can't treat customers any differently. One of the more significant points, item number 4, this is going to be enforced by the Attorney General's Office of the state of California. So the CCPA is not enforcing this. It's not like there's some other, ancillary government and inaugurated organization that's going to be governing this. This is being governed by the Attorney General of the state of California. And that tells you right there, in my humble opinion, that they're taking this very, very seriously, one, and that they're expecting a revenue stream out of this too. And you have to see that one of the bigger challenges, like, really, the Attorney General is going to enforce this? And if the size of the fines are any indication, and they are sizable for violations, that's another key point to just bear in mind. And lastly, literally, just companies that are going to be storing large amounts of personal data are going to have to disclose the type of data they collect, the purpose of the data collection, and how the data is going to be used. They have to be able to be inform their customers of that type of information. So digging down into CCPA in itself, the California Consumer Privacy Act, there are a number of principles that are being promoted. And again, this is not legal advice, this is not a legal interpretation, but just the interpretation of what this means from a data perspective, and that's literally how we're looking at this. There's these customer rights and these personal identifiable data definitions. These things relate directly to business process, the data, and the systems that are going to be managing and facilitating these activities. And I'm not going to read all of this. I mean, this is a pretty good collection, but just as a highlight, a customer has a right to know of all data collected about them. The customer has a right to say no. A customer has a right to call up or contact an organization and say, you know what, you need to delete my data. It's called a right to be forgotten. A customer has a right to be informed of what categories is going to be collected around them. As a case in point, there are, looking at the other side here, the Act specifies what is PI, right? And they have expanded a lot of this. And some, again, this has been thinned down because literally what this is just, it's a very large section of the document. But one of the more interesting things is, in the center right here, the biometric information. There are banks and financial services organizations that are today employing voice print technology. And it's interesting because you'll call up these financial institutions and it's like, oh, well, you've already been verified by your voice print. Like, well, I didn't even know you had a voice print on me. And it was one of the more interesting things because voice printing is actually called out as one of the PII data definitions and what that is. But it's fascinating that These things aren't theoretical. They're not putting them there from a fluff perspective. These things already exist, and they're already in production, and they're already being used. And so when you think about, fingerprint collection and these other biometric indicators, whether it's iris prints and voice prints and the like, just think about that again as it relates to data privacy and how we're storing this information, how this information is being shared, and how many customers, large today, don't even know what type of information is being held about them. So I find that very, very interesting. But again, these are the core principles as we see them from an interpretation of, well, what does this mean to the data? What does this mean about the process and facilitating those data movements? And what does this mean from a systems perspective that have to perform these activities as it relates to the data? So these are, what, as we're talking through it, that drive out a lot of requirements from, again, analysis, discovery, and looking at it from that perspective. But this is not legal advice, and I'm going to say that several times. So some of the CCPA data categories that we've called out are here. So personal identifiers, protected classifications, commercial data. These are areas that are literally called out in the CCPA body of legislation that says these are some of the definitions. Some have been expanded. A lot of them have been here already, right? We already know what device and biometric and personal identifiers are. But what's interesting is a lot of these categories have been expanded. So more definitions have been added, or rather more attributes have been added to these definitions that, you're like, oh, really? Look at number 8, psychometrics, aptitude, ability, IQ. Really? I mean, it just really just keeps getting broader and broader, the definitions. And if you think about putting together a small puzzle of a customer, we all talk about customer 360. We all talk about customer engagement. We all talk about customer experience and how do we put those pieces together that give us a better sight of the customer. That's the customer's interactions and preferences and things along that line. But psychometrics, their ability, their aptitude, their IQ, I think that's really, really interesting that there's a lot of companies that are collecting that type of information. And then, by expanding these categories, it's good, but it puts a greater responsibility on us to think about how we are going to engage and ensure public trust and make sure that, at the end of the day, this comes down to risk, right? Operational risk, reputational risk, business risk. A violation or a data breach that would allow this type of information out, I think, is so much worse than a financial, oh, you've got my credit card number, oh, you got my bank account number. There are things put in place that can help you proactively manage against that. But when something like your privacy data, your biometric data, your IQ, your ability, when that type of breach occurs, how does an organization recover from that? So understanding that these data categories, we really have to think about what is the onus and what steps do we take to ensure the public trust that we are going to manage their private data in such a way that it is protected as best as possible and that we're being proactive ensuring that it is protected. That's the key thing in looking at these data categories is it becomes much more than just bits and bytes. It's much more than 0 or 1s, because what you're really talking about is a commitment of trust to your business partners, to your customers, to your members, but additionally accountability and ensuring that you're minimizing your organization's risk from an operations, from a business, from a reputational perspective. So now that we've talked about kind of a broad overview of what CCPA is, how that it came about, it's, like I said, it's very similar to GDPR, and we use GDPR as a lot as a comparator because to date there really hasn't been anything as significant or to compare it to. So you are going to hear that a lot. Now, what do you do with all that information? How do you begin to internalize that and turn that into something that you can deliver? And so with that, now we're going to talk about strategy development methodology around that. You have to start with, again, it all starts with the data. And I think that, we've all come to recognize that data is an asset. It is an incredibly powerful asset that can bolster an organization, but by not protecting that data, by not putting in place a way to keep that data out of malicious hands, it can be a highly destructive force as well, right? So the data privacy lifecycle, starting here, understanding what it means from data as it moves from coming into an organization, what happens to it, the business processes. So the data lifecycle, again, is leveraged very highly, especially in our methodology and our approach, understanding what the business process is of that data. Who owns that data? You might hear shades of data governance in here because they're tightly related. So if you caught on to that already, kudos to you. That alignment of personal identifiable data to the enterprise data framework. Now, what that is if you have an organization, you're going to have some data, some critical core domains of data that are necessary to manage the organization. And that's what we generally refer to as an enterprise data framework, taking those domains of data and putting it in an organized structure. Alignment of how do you set that personal identifiable data align to those domains? From a data acquisition and ingestion perspective, where did this data come from? How did it get into our organization? Is there any type of data hygiene or cleansing or quarantining that we're doing before this data enters our environment? What is the purpose and management of that data? We can't just have it just to have, but what are we doing with it? And are any of these activities manual or automated? What about the unstructured data? For a large number of organizations, in as much as the digital transformation wave has been washing over us all, a great many organizations still deal with scanned documents. There are some documents where a wet signature is required, where where scanned documents, images are required. How are we protecting the privacy data in those scanned documents? Oh, it's in a DMS, and that's not enough. We have to consider that I've seen emails, Post-its. There's the breadth of unstructured data is so broad and pervasive that we think about, oh, if it's in this system, if it's in this database, if it's in this Excel file, and I've got a password around it and it's encrypted. Yeah, but there's all of the unstructured data as well. And cyber security really refers to that data in electronic form. Information security relies to that data in any form. And so that's kind of where the two come together. We need to think about that. Data integration and movement, how that data is moved again from inside the four walls, logically speaking, of course, and outside the four walls to your business partner. And then what happens when that data crosses borders? Data sovereignty. Data sovereignty is a key issue to this, which basically that means is if I have a business in Arizona, as it were, and I do business outside of the borders of the United States, let's say Canada, let's say Europe. If I have a data repository that sits in Europe, or I have a large number of businesses a large number of repositories in Europe and Canada, and that data has crossed the border, whose laws are, what are the exposures of that data to the laws of that country? That's data sovereignty and figuring that out. And these are the things that generally fall under the radar. So when we look at data privacy lifecycle, all the way from the data overview, all the way down to information security, without having a strategic approach to this and understanding it, these are where a lot of these gaps come in. So it's very critical that when you're thinking about it, and that's not just germane to CCPA, but Look at how your data privacy management, your data, your information security, your cybersecurity, look at those processes, look at those initiatives, and think about, are we being as comprehensive as we should be? And number one, what are we doing about unstructured data? There's a number of tools that are out there. This is not a recommendation. This is not an exhaustive list, but there are a number of data privacy management tools out there that can assist with data scanning, catalog, lineage, and management of these data components. So when you're thinking about, even after you thinking about this proactively, you stood up the capability, you understand where the privacy data is, you understand what systems are being used, how are you going to maintain that? So the periodic scans of data, how is that going to happen? Who's going to do that? Who's responsible for doing that? It's not something that's done just once and we get a status, everybody stands around, thumbs up, clapping each other on the shoulder. This is something that has to be done repeatedly on a regular basis. It needs to be kept in the front of mind of people all the time. So you need a tool, and perhaps a number of tools that are going to help you do that. Excuse me. So with that, there are a number of tools that are out there. Again, this is not a recommended list. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just a list of some of the tools that you may want to consider, you may want to look at based on your organizational needs, your capability to support them, and what have you. There are a number of others that are out there, again, but these are just some that we come across on a regular basis. Okay. So what is our strategy development approach? So when you're thinking about how you are going to manage this data, it's important to think about not only that life cycle of data privacy, but think about the complexity of the various data classifications, data categories and systems. You have CRM systems, ERP systems, MDM systems, policy management, claims. You have loan origination systems. You have loan and lease servicing systems. You have different types of aggregator data repositories, whether they're line of business ODSs, subject area ODSs, data mart. Think about the complexity of the different structures and formats that this data exists. And so when you're thinking about the data classifications and categories and systems and how do you approach it, again, having a very clear and articulated roadmap of discovery, if you will, is critically important. We start with the data inventory. And through a series of interviews, we work with the team to document the PI data that's collected and what's being done with it. So what are the processes that are applied to this data, and what are you doing with it? Now, the reason that this one is most important is because think about it like this. In most organizations, not all, but certainly most, I have a functional line of business that they need data. They're going to go to their data provisioning team, whether it's IS, whether it's a data specialist in their group. They're going to say, hey, I need this particular data set. And the group that provisions the data is going to be, well, you know what? We provide this data set to another group, but it has the same data you need. And they're going to go, okay, fine, let me have that data set. Well, the challenge here is oftentimes there is going to be additional data in that data set that you don't necessarily need. It's just superfluous. And you treat it as such. You know what? It's superfluous. I don't need it. But with regard to CCPA, there are certain data attributes that say if you are, there are certain guidelines that say if you are not using this data, you should not have this data in this system. So what does that mean? It's like, oh, wow, well, we've just been taking this data feed from the mainframe for 4 or 5 years. We just ignore the other data. Or, we just bring the other data attributes in and expand the table. We don't use them, but they're there. Going forward, we're going to have to fix that. We're going to have to remove those superfluous data elements from those data feeds, from those integrations, that means that the underlying data tables are going to have to change. To not accept that data if that data is not being processed, if it's not germane to that specific process. So by understanding through those series of interviews, this data inventory, if you will, we have to understand what data is being brought into a given line of business, what they're doing with it from a business process perspective, and we have to map that from the point of data ingestion, collection, processing, and storage. So you have to map that data all the way through that transition, all the way through that integration to say, here's where the data enters, here's where the data exits, and this is how the data gets archived or destroyed or what have you. That mapping, that data discovery needs to be done. And we're going to gather, we gather supporting documents and requirements around databases, database schemas, and then third-party data protection agreements. Now that's key because, sharing data across not only lines of business, but within business partners, your business partners have, and vice versa, have to provide affidavits, documents, signature sheets that say, we are going to adhere to the law and to your best practices and what you stipulate with regard to handling your customer data or your organization's data. And again, having that refreshable and in a place where you can put your hands on it is critically important. Risk clarification. This is what it all comes down to, is risk and risk management. And whether you are, again, talking operational risk, business risk, reputational risk, by having these potential exposures out there, it comes down to risk. It really, really does. How is this data mapped to the relevant business systems, the business processes? How are the data elements classified? And what are the associated risk levels? And that's what's critically important. I mean, especially now, we have to look at, as I mentioned, every channel, which are the processes, the data repositories, the IVR, the web, the mobile apps. And then again, it moves into policy, practices, and compliance review. So our team works with your organization's legal and compliance department because, again, we're not lawyers, we're not attorneys. So a legal interpretation of what the compliance policy means to your organization and what does it mean to your organization to be in compliance with that law and regulation, we can't say that. But as we help you draw out the requirements, we can say, well, this is how we craft a requirement to address that. This is how, and it's a lot more difficult than you think because, again, you're not just simply talking about a technical requirement or a business requirement or a non-functional requirement as a bit of a software or an implementation, but you really have to think about the people, process, and technology aspects as you're building out these requirements. So that policy and practices compliance review helps organizations understand, what does this mean to us from putting this into practice? Not the interpretation of the legal requirement, but how do you take that interpretation and then convert that into something applicable for the environment at an operational level? And again, that's across processes, people, and technology. Then what is the gap analysis, the findings report, and then again, the policy and practices change guidance. Huge piece of this. Most organizations, whether it's a digital transformation, business transformation, data-driven transformation, transform into Superman if you need to, without having that change management aspect, without having that communication to the business, you are going to be facing an uphill battle. I don't care, it's coming from the judicial, the legal, this is regulatory, and the guy in the suits and show up and the fedoras and the brown shoes, and you know what, that's great. And the organization will adopt a posture to align with it, but to get it adopted, to make sure that it's part of the organization, that change management piece must be there. So that data inventory, risk classification, policy and process compliance review findings report and gap analysis, and then what is the change guidance, what is the change management aspect of it that has to be a part of that successful implementation. This is how you develop a strategy. This is something that, again, is easier to repeat once you've done it several times, but starting out to build this by yourself, it can be very daunting. It can be very challenging. And you have to be very patient because that is one of the key aspects of this. And so once we can actually show an example of what this means. So across that same life cycle, I'm going to pop back really quick. Data inventory all the way through policy and guidance, and then take that data inventory all the way through the gap analysis. So there are associated activities with each step. These are just some high level. This isn't an exhaustive view, but this is a high level overview of some of the activities associated with these various classes. And again, I'm not going to read through all of this, but the alignment with legal, compliance and risk stakeholders to review the existing data policy, that's critical. And then armed with that information, let's now start mapping through the data. And then once we begin to get a sense of what is the lay of the land, what is the landscape, we then work to then understand what are your definitions, your data categories. And then again, there's numerous other activities to go through, but look at the expected outcomes. This is what's key. And this, again, this is tailored to the organization because as much as we'd love to believe it, there is no one size fits all. There is no cookie cutter approach, because what makes an organization successful, what is their secret sauce, what is germane to them and their culture, has to be factored in to any approach. You have to think about, well, yeah, these are standard activities, but you know what? This organization doesn't like this activity. Okay, you can't get caught up in the movements of the music, but understand what are the expected outcomes. What is that? And so looking at those business functional areas, those process models, data ownership, data categories, data classifications, method of ingestion, system mapping, purpose and function, data integrations, what is the purpose and function of the data and the method of processing the data, and right here, structured and unstructured data. It's key. And this, the data archival, retention and destruction, how is that being done? Who's doing it? Where is it happening? And then these are the expected outcomes that are going to go into your project plan that then allow you to execute and deliver on this. This CCPA compliance review, if you've done some GDPR work, if you were required to adhere to GDPR, then you're further ahead of the curve than most. But if you were not required to adhere to GDPR, and these are things that you have to get up and get running, let me tell you, January 1st, 2020 will be here before you know it. Because it's not so much the implementation of the roadmap, don't get me wrong, that's going to take some time itself, but it's getting through where are we? Where are we today? What does our process look like? This is what's going to be most daunting and most challenging. And getting that process in place where, again, the organization understands this is, again, not just regulation for regulation's sake. If you talk about customer experience, if customer interaction, customer engagement means anything to you, if you do believe that servicing requires a great deal of trust and there should be accountability, this is something that should be top of mind. Because, again, this is how you establish and grow that customer trust and that customer experience and that business partner value and supply. I mean, it literally just goes on where the value proposition of this is, but it is a shorter runway than you think. And that's just one of the key things to share. So let's talk about estimating costs. Now, again, just like I told before, we're not a legal firm. The disclaimer, this is not legal advice. From an estimations perspective, we leveraged information that is out there from various partners. A lot of this information were leveraged, as an example, from courtesy of CCPA Partners. They are an industry research firm and gave a lot of guidance on how do you go about estimating CCPA, because there are very few organizations, as I'm sure most of you can attest to, that are even talking about CCPA, right? So there's very fewer organizations that have done CCPA because it's brand new, right? Here's the other rub. Most organizations that are talking to you about GDPR haven't done that either. They haven't. They provide a lot of bodies. They'll provide arms and legs in getting the activities done, but actually partnering with organizations to think through what is the strategy, what is the approach. There's very, very few companies that have actually done that. So working with CCPA Partners, what CCPA Partners does is they produce a lot of this industry information across industries with regards to insurance, oil and gas, telecom, finance, materials and packaged goods, manufacturing. They produce a lot of industry analytics around, particularly around GDPR. And so by looking at GDPR as a comparator, you're able to get some estimates on the structure and how do you go about estimating a plan like this. So number one, implementation costs increase with firm size. GDPR implementation was clearly impacted by an increasing number of factors such as firm sizes. What's also interesting, the biggest outliers from a GDPR implementation perspective were insurance and oil and gas. And you're like, really? Those are like so far away. Well, think about it like this. It really comes down to the complexity of your systems, the number of products, service lines, and again, number of resources, number of people touching it, your particular process model. All of those things factor into the estimation of cost. One of the things that CCPA Partners recommended is look at the number of resources you have, and based on your organization type, based on your organization size, they do provide some estimates, and we could talk about that in other conversations on what those actual specific dollar estimates are. But there is actually a range that says if you have N number of resources, and which is kind of called out here, if you have N number of resources and you're in this industry, this is roughly what your GDPR implementation cost is going to run you. And they did this across a number of different industries, but again, the outliers, biggest outliers, being insurance and oil and gas because of the complexity of their systems and the complexity of their data. Again, another bit of information that we gleaned from CCPA Partners around cost allocation is that how it breaks out. It's not, again, a technology-driven play as you think. Yes, there is some technology cost there. There's some people cost there. Obviously, it's a little larger. But look at where the biggest piece of recommended information is. It's in your process focus costs, right? Because there are processes that are undocumented. There are processes that people aren't familiar with. There are workarounds that have come up over the years to accommodate systems that may not meet the need. And it is in that area where the largest costs are found. And then so from estimating ongoing, now that it's running, now that we've done all the base activities, we've slid this up, now it has to be incorporated into the fabric of the organization. These are, again, some of the estimates that we had gathered from ranges across the activity centers of policy development, communications, program management, information security, forensics and monitoring, and enforcement. And the medium, minimum, medium, and maximum. And there are values for each industry. And again, so comparing it to GDPR, which is the closest, again, these values have been collected from, 53 different, from here, insurance companies that had implemented GDPR compliance requirements to their overall data regulation and compliance capabilities. Again, so this isn't just a raw startup. This is including it in what you're doing today, and then at a target where these compliance overall compliance costs should be from a minimum, medium, and maximum perspective. And again, we can always have further detailed conversations around the specifics, but again, this is just to give you an overview. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is, from a GDPR perspective, is the governance, right? So we talked about what CCPA is. We talked about how do you go about planning for your strategy. We showed some examples of activities that are included in actually building out that work, and we even give you some cost guidelines with regard to estimation, implementation, and ongoing. Here's the last piece that I want to share, and this is really around information governance. And it comes down to a lot because at the end of the day, you know, there's a lot of discussion. Well, where does this sit? Why isn't this data governance? Why isn't this information security? Why isn't this cybersecurity? They're all related. You know, that's the punchline, right? These are all related. There is a great deal of overlap between them all, but instead of thinking it from a data governance perspective or a cybersecurity perspective or an information security, we really need to adopt the paradigm of information governance. And that literally spans up and down the model. When you think about it in terms of information governance, you then think about the organization as a whole. Because CCPA is compliance focused, and again, it's focused on data privacy. It spans the entire organization, all the way from your corporate level, through your IT governance, down through your data governance. There are touch points at every level of the organization. And that's what it means to have a data privacy or compliance strategy. It doesn't apply to a line of business. It doesn't apply to a functional area. We have to begin to rethink that when we hear the terms information or governance or security, it's not an IT problem. It's not a chief information security officer problem. This is something that needs to expand all the way from the executive board all the way down to the customer service reps that are working on your CRM applications, and the data engineers that are working on your ERPs and your line of business systems. It literally, information governance spans that entire model. When we consider information security and cybersecurity, you know, there is an overlap to them. There's a focus separately, right? And trusty Venn diagram. On the right-hand side, if we look at cybersecurity, wherein, you know, the hardware, the application, and network security is about protecting that data that's found in electronic form. On the left-hand side, we're looking at information security, is, you know, making sure that data is secure in any form. But there is an overlap between the two. The data security, the data value, the physical security, and the access controls. This is just a subset, right? I didn't want to have to build out the entire Venn diagram with 64,000 words in a word cloud, but I just kind of wanted to point out that there is a significant overlap. You can't have a discussion with one without the other. And then there, you know, what underlies this is the data piece of this. Here's where data governance comes in. And then I know people that beat their heads against the wall trying to draw the perfect picture of the overlap between information security and cybersecurity and data governance and data management, and where does it all come together? And really, it's a continuum. It's not a one or the other. It's literally a shared responsibility. And what's key here is figuring out where that accountability lies in an organization. How are we as an organization going to establish information governance? And it is, you know, the next, it's the next step, but just being able to incorporate this. And so, you know, information governance is not just an IT issue. It's not a business and IT owned issue. It's an organizational issue where, granted, there must be a structured formulation of how it's going to be owned and accountable. But I love this one here. So this gentleman, his name is Barclay T. Blair. He's the executive director of the Information Governance Initiative, which is a think tank. It's just a think tank, and these guys get together and they literally just ponder, they ruminate upon these concepts. And this statement captured, I think, is a very clear articulation of that. These two are executed in different parts of the company, between information governance and data governance, where there's different practical tools. Information governance is mostly concerned with risk mitigation. Data governance is really concerned with like data quality, master data management, and dashboards. But when you bring them together in that continuum, you have that span all the way from risk and compliance all the way through data and analytics. And then the linchpin, what's in the center, if you will, is that data governance piece, that continuum of information governance. Now, this, I'm going to be very, very clear where the words above are captured from the gentleman Barclay T. Blair. This beautiful piece of artwork on the continuum of information governance is a piece of artwork we created. It doesn't exist. It's not proprietary to anyone, but it just kind of puts it in order of how we really need to just redress and rethink these things. The continuum of information governance, if you will. That's it. That's the end. That's the end of this webinar. I really appreciate those that stayed through the end and listened. I'm not sure if there are any questions. I'll take a look really quickly. Oh, there are some questions. I don't know if I can read it. Oh, okay. So those question that I see is, does CCPA require you to act on your unstructured data as well, or is it just structured data? It's both. It is structured and unstructured. And there's more questions here. I don't know how to open them. I'm going to try to figure out how I can expand this questions piece.
Solomon, I can read these off to you. I've got the panel up here.
Yeah, because I can't expand it, if you'd be so kind.
Which question are you looking at?
So I see something. What are implications? I can barely see it for some reason. I can't.
Yeah. Yep.
If you could
okay. Nope. I've got you here. So, and thanks again, Solomon. That was a fantastic presentation. This is why we love having you present. The question that you're looking at is, what are implications for customer data for how a company promotes services and products to existing customers?
Well, so CCPA doesn't necessarily target how you promote products and services. It's not saying that you can't do that. It's just saying that what CCPA is focused on is how we manage that privacy data of an individual, right? So if you're adhering to the context, the spirit of the legal and compliance regulation, then your promotional tactics, I don't think, will change significantly unless you are using that data in such a way, like selling that data or using their data to contact them outside of the windows of their preferences and things along that line. So if you're using that data in such a way that then undermines the usage of the data collected, then yes, you need to then examine how you're promoting your products and services. But from just a sheer marketing campaign perspective, or whether you're doing direct mail or what have you, are you allowed to have that data, and are you allowed to use that customer's data in that way? I think is what you're asking, and that is germane to your agreement with that customer.
Okay, great, Solomon. Thanks so much. And we are at the top of the hour here. I'm sure people have meetings to get to, so we're going to cut off the questions there. But for everyone that did attend and asked a question here, we're going to have Solomon answer these offline, and then I will publish the Q&A as a blog post. I'll send a link to that to everyone who registered for this presentation. So once again, thank you, everyone. And Solomon, really quick, if you could go to that last slide, I just want to let everybody know that we do have another webinar coming up next month. And this one is Thursday, October 25th, Data Governance, the Start of Something Wonderful, and that will be with Nancy Kuchar. So make sure you tune in for that one. Thank you all for attending and for staying a couple minutes late here, and look forward to the recording of this webinar being posted on our website. Thanks, Solomon.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.